Or particularly 84, I had moved out to Texas. I started experiencing this thing where when I would be in the runs, particularly of races, it was like I was ventilating so fast, almost like panning. And then I would get both stitches and I would get wheezing, right? So wheezing is the sound that our body makes when our bronchi, those big tubes that come down to each lung, when they start to constrict. So my bronchi clearly went into constriction. So I went to a physician at the time. He said, well, at the time we didn't have the concept of exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. We just assumed, physicians assumed you had asthma. So he presumed I had asthma and said, I think you have asthma. Let's put you on theophylline. So they don't even use theophylline anymore because it's sort of a stimulant and creates all kinds of bad effects. But it used to be a maintenance drug for asthma. So I took that for like 2 days, and I was like this, right? I was like, I'm not taking that. So I just managed that for the next 15 or 20 years, I understood that the stimuli had to do with the air being drier. It had to do sometimes with cold, which is also when the air is often drier. It would have to do potentially with pollutants in the air, things like that. So I did a lot of my hard training indoors to try to avoid that. In races, I quite often just experienced this, and I would just try to work through it. I basically had an early version of what we now call exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. So if you wanted to think about that simplistically, if breathing air is actually damaging your lung, the body, I believe in body wisdom, right? I usually try to explain it physiologically, but I believe the body tries to figure out how to deal with anything. So the body tries to figure out how to deal with that by constricting your bronchi so you can't breathe as much because you're doing this to yourself, right? So people don't like to say that on the medical side, even though if you read all the review papers on EIB, they're mostly acknowledging this is, self-induced. In fact, this one guy, I won't mention his name either. He got booby-trapped by some guy on a podcast asking about my data, which he'd never even looked at. And then he was like, well, that can't be right. And, it was like left at that, right? He would talk about, he actually wrote a paper about the idea that endurance athletes, professional endurance athletes or elite endurance athletes suffer this as an occupational hazard. So we see rates of more than 50% in some sports. Cross-country skiing is probably the worst case scenario, right? Particularly over in Norway and places where they do it really, really well. Although our program now is really good too, and so I think we're probably seeing a lot of this in our program as well. The majority of the athletes almost seem to have EIB. You can literally hear this. We have this woman, Jessie, can't think of her last name, but she's our number one. It has been for a while. She's won a couple of gold medal, or at least one gold medal in the Olympic Games. She won the big tour that they have, the multi-day stage race once or twice. She's a great skier and clearly works super hard. But, I watched her or listened on this broadcast to her finishing the first year she won that tour, and it was clear she was in massive EIB, right? You could hear the wheezing even on the broadcast. And I'm just thinking, somebody needs to address that, right? So I'm sure they have her on bronchodilators. I think subsequently I've read that she, has done bronchodilator therapy. I believe I've read that. I hope I'm not inaccurate in saying that. But I'm thinking, hey, you know what? Mostly that goes away.
Is that what happened to you?
Yes, that's what happened to me. So many, many years later when I was teaching here, it's now 20 years ago, but it was well after I first developed this. When I started breathing nasally, it just went away. Right? I stopped having those episodes. I don't have episodes of that at all anymore. So why is that? Well, when we breathe nasally, all that conditioning happens. We fully humidify the air. We bring it to body temperature. We remove significant amounts of particulate matter, pollutants, other things that might have gotten in there that could also be doing damage to our lung. And our lung seems to somehow recognize that instantly, right? That this is good quality air, no need to constrict the bronchi. So I have this, I won't say his name either, but a football player I had in class just this last year. So great player for us. I love this kid. He has bad EIB though, right? He's on a bronchodilator and he knew it, right? So we came around to having him run the mile and a quarter mile. I have him do some stuff in their physiology class where we look at how those different distances relate. And he shows up and I'm like, did you take your bronchodilators? No, I'm going to try to do it breathing nasally. So he did this out of the box without attempting to adapt to this at all. And he went and ran a quarter mile probably within a few seconds of what he's capable of. He's a very good runner, right? I'll say that he probably could run 50, at this point even playing football, probably could run a quarter in 55, 56. He ran like a minute just breathing nasally. And then he ran his mile also relatively close to what he was capable of. And he went into big time air hunger and pain, you could tell, right? But he didn't have that significant EIB response. He was like freaked out because he assumed if he ever did that, he would, without his bronchodilator, he would have a big time bronchoconstrictive response and go into almost an emergency episode. He did have a little bit though. We measured what's called his FEV1, his forced expiratory volume, before and after, because we're evaluating whether you have EIB when we have you run the mile. And he had a little bit of a drop, but it wasn't a huge drop. But then I said to him, did you take a bunch of big oral breaths as soon as you got in? And absolutely, because he put himself into like significant air hunger. He wasn't adapted yet for this. And then right away took 3 or 4 big breaths. And even that was enough to give him a little bit of a bronchoconstrictive response. I experienced that myself when I first adapted to this. I went and ran the fastest mile in a corporate cup in Pueblo that I had run in 4 or 5 years. And, I was like in my late 40s, right? So I had no business doing that. But I did breathing nasally. And so first time I ever actually won the corporate cup event outright. And so I took a couple of big breaths right after I crossed the finish line. So I hadn't pushed myself yet. I'd adapted, but I hadn't ever been in that competitive situation, pushed myself that far. And, right away I was hacking and coughing, all the classic stuff that happens when you've been breathing orally, right? So I don't know if I had an EIB response because I didn't have a way to test it right there at the scene, but I knew that it was bad that I had taken those big breaths orally right at the end.
So obviously you got adapted, right?
Yep.
And it's one thing to get adapted. And you said you were in your 40s.
48 I was.
48?
Actually. Yeah, I think.
At that point, right, did your performance go up or did you just maintain?
So I actually got better. Again, when you're, it wasn't like I was new to triathlon. At 48, I'd already been doing triathlon 20 some years, right? And so the mile is an example. I had been running this corporate cup mile, and I'm a big guy, right? I used to play 2 meters in water polo. So these are good times for a big guy. I was running that corporate cup mile, 6 minutes, 5:45 in that range, right? So I ran a 5:32, right? Breathing nasally the year after the year I adapted to doing this, which was enough to win in that at that time. We have a 20K or 12-mile bike ride we also do in that corporate cup. And I had been doing that generally 30, 31 minutes. I'm also a pretty good cyclist. And I think I rode 29:30 that year, breathing nasally, right? So, that's when my brain started to turn away from, I'm just doing this so I don't get sick all the time, into, wow, this is actually making me better, right? At a time when you're not supposed to get better, right? You're supposed to be fighting off getting slower, right? It's also not like I had started training harder or anything like that. So the one thing that did happen at that time when I spent the year adapting to doing this, so 6 months to a year, I also started using a neti pot every day. So I stopped getting sick. The other thing in my history is that from the time I was an age group swimmer, I was chronically sick a lot. Upper respiratory stuff, pneumonia, bronchitis. Once I got up here to altitude, lots of sinus infections too. And I just stopped getting sick through a combination of just using a neti pot every day and breathing nasally during my training. So at the time I thought, well, I'm just training more consistently, right? I'm not losing those gaps you get when you have pneumonia, you have to stop training for 2-3 weeks sometimes. But later on, when we did the study, it started to become apparent that it was maybe something more than that, right? That this isn't just you could train more consistently, you're fighting off infection or dealing with the problems of infection in endurance training more adequately, which again would apply to CrossFit guys too, and women. It also probably is something else, and that's why we kind of set up our study to look at the idea of economy, because we thought maybe this has to do with that, right? And then, bam, it did.